Hello, this is the first of two short presentations regarding qualitative research. I'm Sarah Bekaert, Senior Lecturer in the Children's Nursing team, and in this presentation, I'll be talking about what qualitative research is and what it offers. I'll then introduce some of the main methodologies with their associated data collection methods, their approaches to data analysis, and other specific key aspects. And then the second presentation will drill down some more on the research process, ethical considerations, and quality assessment of qualitative research. So firstly, let's distinguish between methodology and method. A methodology is a way of approaching the research, and method, the steps in conducting a research study. And there are methods that are typical to certain methodologies. In addition, there are some terms and understandings and concepts that are associated with different methodologies, although some are relevant to several or all. So let's start with what's common across qualitative research. Quantitative research tests theory and deals with measurements and cause and effect, and qualitative is exploratory and inductive. And an inductive study is where meaning is inferred, concluded from evidence and reasoning. And this calls for interpretation, whether this be from the researcher or the reader of the research report. Qualitative research tends to explore experiences or cultures or situations, so where there are layers or many aspects to be considered within the interpretation. And I'll quickly mention here sensitizing concepts. These are the things that the researcher feels should be explored. And the person who coined this term, Herbert Blumer, was actually not specific on how this comes about. So it could be perhaps from the researcher's curiosity, something they've experienced through practice, or coming out of the data itself. And this should be clearly explained, the rationale for this research study, in the background section to a research study write-up, or indeed when you're putting forward a research proposal. Now, in qualitative research, the data itself tends to typically be words, people's words, so through interviews or focus groups. However, documents and pictures or photographs are also used. And in the analysis of qualitative research, researchers are looking for themes and issues and relationships and concepts, so truths, possibilities, rather than a specific truth. Qualitative projects can be standalone, or they can add insight into a quantitative study. And we're seeing more and more mixed method studies as this relationship becomes more accepted and qualitative research gains credibility. So I'm going to go through this table because it gives a quick overview of the differences between quantitative and qualitative research. And actually, I'm going to start at the ontology row, because really this is where it all begins. Ontology considers what is knowledge. So how the researcher views the world, or perhaps less dramatically the research question, will influence the approach taken. So if the research question or approach presumes there is a world out there to be discovered, that phenomena exist beyond people or social aspects, this is objectivism. A qualitative ontology suggests there's no world out there that's independent of social actors or people. We perceive everything. And we are all individuals, albeit with various cultures, with our own and sometimes shared understandings. And this changes over time. And this understanding of the world is constructionism. So moving up a row, epistemology considers how we create knowledge. So we have our ontological understanding, and from that we create knowledge through epistemological approaches. So an objective ontology is linked to a positivist epistemology. If independent phenomena exist, then you're likely to test this out seeking a truth. Constructionism is linked to an interpretive epistemology, making interpretations and seeking truths. So then we link the top and bottom row. An objective positivist approach will be deductive, testing theory, and therefore uses numbers and statistics. And a constructionist interpretive approach will be inductive, data-driven, generating theory, and usually uses words. So let's go back to our methodologies. So the approach to the research. And these have been debated and developed over many, many years. There are several well-established methodologies and some new. And more often than not, the established approaches reflect and incorporate new thinking into the established approach as thinking evolves and changes over time. And that's why I put a picture of a tree here. So this is to illustrate this relationship. So the trunk could be qualitative research, and the main branches, the established qualitative methodologies, and the smaller branches off the main branches, different approaches to each core methodological approach. So it's quite complicated. It could be said that the first three methodologies on this slide are the core ones, and in the next slide I'll describe these. And then I've included narrative, inquiry, and discourse analysis as two other significant approaches, and I'll briefly describe those. I've also included feminist methodology, as it's important to recognise the huge influence feminist thinking in relation to research ontology, and therefore epistemology, has had on all established methodologies. And just at the bottom here, I really recommend Carla Willig's text for an introduction to all methodologies. So let's start with ethnography. This is an in-depth study of a culture or group and the people within it, and it usually involves a long period of fieldwork. So all sorts of data is gathered from notes on conversations, observations in a field diary, possibly questionnaires, looking at documents, etc. And this is all brought together in a detailed description or thick description of the culture or group being studied. And the researcher also considers how being an insider to the group being studied, an emic position, or outsider to the group being studied, etic position, has influenced the data generated. Classically, historically, perhaps, this has been where a researcher goes to live with a particular tribe, for example. So Margaret Mead went to live with a tribe in Samoa in the early 20th century and explored their thinking around sexuality. However, it can also be applied to specific local and more time-measured projects, such as this one here, which I've included here, where the researchers spent time observing newly qualified nurses, interviewing them and analysing documents to explore their transition from student to registered nurse. And then we have phenomenology. And this is frequently used in nursing because we tend to want to know, what is it like to experience what you're experiencing? You know, what can we learn from your experience of this and how we practice? So a phenomenology explores experience, looking for the essence or commonalities of an experience. And of course, there are different approaches to phenomenology. And these different approaches broadly illustrate phenomenology's journey from taking quantitative research approaches as the credible way to do research to incorporating interpretivist and feminist-driven considerations. So a descriptive phenomenology does just that. It describes findings rather than interpreting. Perhaps a little bit like the thick description of ethnography. And interpretive phenomenology brings in interpretation of findings. And this is linked to how the role of a researcher is viewed. So one approach is to remove the researcher as much as possible from the process to avoid any influence on the data. And this is a bit like removing any bias in quantitative studies. So if you take this approach, the researcher will bracket themselves away from the research process. So, for example, the interview would be a series of set questions with little response to or interaction with the participant. And then the researcher tries not to let previous knowledge or experience influence their analysis of the data. Later versions of phenomenology are more reflexive and examine how the researcher position or experience or knowledge directs and influences the method, the data gathering and interpretation of the findings. So a phenomenology or exploration of experience usually uses in-depth interviewing as the method, and data analysis typically looks for essence or themes. A grounded theory generates theory and is used when very little is known about a topic. So you'd start with some interviews, analyse these. This would generate more questions, and then you'd interview another group regarding those specific questions, and it carries on like that. So it's more of an iterative, evolving process, but allows for interpretation as you go along and exploration in directions that wouldn't have been predicted before the research commenced. So like phenomenology, early grounded theory approaches took a blank slate approach in that the researcher just should assume no previous knowledge or theories on the subject in hand. And in some schools of grounded theory, this has evolved, and the researcher reflexively considers their position, their experience and knowledge in relation to the interpretation of the findings. Interviews and focus groups are typical methods for grounded theory, and data analysis takes a constant comparative approach, comparing each interview or focus group to the next and the next, looking for commonalities, but also outliers and areas less covered. And these less typical aspects will perhaps dictate the focus of exploration for the next round of interviews. And in grounded theory, when nothing new is being learned about a particular exploratory thread, it's assumed data saturation has been achieved and you've found all possible answers to this particular question. Narrative inquiry looks at individuals' experiences, but also looks at how people create meaning in their accounts. When people describe their experience to a researcher, there are social and cultural and institutional narratives that are present in those accounts. And a narrative inquiry looks at these particular aspects. It explores how people create meaning in their lives within their narratives or through their narratives. So an example might be Arthur Frank, who carried out interviews with people who'd experienced cancer and suggested that the participants took on 3 possible narratives. One being restitution, I'm ill now, but I will be normal again. A quest narrative, this illness has taken me on a journey and I will arrive at a different, wiser position once it's over. And then a chaos narrative, where the person experiencing the illness doesn't know what's going on, can't find a coherent identity within the illness. Narrative inquiry can use many methods, so interviews always, but also uses art, so painting or collage or photography as a prompt or part of the narrative, part of the description, part of the story that the person is telling. And the data analysis of that looks for narratives and discourses. What do the accounts or images say about the socio-cultural aspects of how participants present their story? And then we have discourse analysis. So this specifically looks at how language constructs meaning. So it's more of a data analysis approach than a methodology per se. So a discourse analysis highlights how there are accepted cultural ways of being and patterns of knowledge that are powerful in themselves. And this approach mainly comes from the work of Foucault. So for example, in my doctoral research, I did a document analysis of government policy relating to teenage pregnancy and parenthood. And within these documents, there were targets to reduce rates, expectations to get back to school and work. And within this, it highlighted an emergent, powerful, negative citizenship discourse regarding teenage parenthood, which didn't exist before in previous documents. And then a similar analysis of interviews of teenage mothers themselves show how these negative discourses have been integrated into their presentations of self, where they were keen to return to school and to not be seen as a failure. And this aspect of the study was a narrative inquiry approach. And my final slide looks very briefly at feminist research. There is a feminist methodology, and this is important in itself, and it has several aims. So the first is to increase knowledge about women's lives, and this was previously absent in research. So for example, in children's nursing, we learn about cognitive development of children with Piaget's theory, and Piaget's work was all done with male students. Girls were not considered, or if they were, presumed to just be the same as boys. Another aim is to advocate for women, so show that women may experience things differently to men, And this covers quantitative research as well as qualitative. So, for example, drugs act differently in men and women. And that seems obvious to us now, but it wasn't always considered so. This methodology also considers gender oppression, obviously, and ultimately aims to transform society. But it's also important to acknowledge how feminist philosophy has influenced change across all methodologies, specifically with regard to relationality, reflexivity, which has come up a few times so far, and intersectionality. And I'm really briefly going to cover these here, but there's a lot more to say about them. So the main influence of feminist philosophy and research is relationality, that we are all in relation to each other. We act, speak, and understand ourselves in relationship. And Carol Gilligan is an important philosopher in this respect. And this concept or way of understanding directly challenges things such as the possibility of bracketing, removing oneself from the research process. Is that actually possible? Anne Oakley explored this relationality in relation to the research interview and suggested the impossibility of removing the research influence from this interaction. Our positionality, so for example, our race, our professional role, our life experience will have a bearing on how the participant interacts with us and the accounts they give. And she suggested this should be explored and acknowledged rather than trying to ignore or eliminate or remove this. And then this led to a multi-layered debate regarding reflexivity. This is where it's recognised that the research will have an influence on the research process and that this should be formally and explicitly examined for all stages of the research. So why you're doing it, how you're doing it, during the process of gathering data, when you're doing the analysis and in the presentations of the results. The research is there. And it needs to be acknowledged and sort of rendered visible. So this ultimately, this approach accepts that the researcher is part of the research rather than external to it. And lastly, but definitely not leastly, at least I want to mention intersectionality. So intersectionality, Kimberly Crenshaw takes feminist thinking regarding oppression and transformation beyond the one dimension of being female to consider other and intersecting areas of disadvantage, such as race, disability, etc. I've ended here with the feminist, with the Facebook, icon from the Feminist Research Network, which illustrates this really well. So it shows the oppression of women in the style of The Handmaid's Tale, but also includes women of colour, disability, and various ages. This is a really interesting area of research philosophy at the moment. Just to end, there are two specific references here. However, I've mentioned many other philosophers and introduced many concepts in this presentation. And I didn't want to give specific references for them as they will have been prolific in their writing. Their thinking often changed over time and other people will have written about them. So finding one text that's perfect for each would have been really, really hard. But if you want to know any more about any of the particular philosophies or authors or philosophers, please do contact me. My email's here and we can have a conversation about what might be the sort of go-to text or resource to explore that further. Just have a conversation, that would be nice. So thank you for your time, and that's the end of the first presentation on qualitative methods.